Jack Harris stepped off the plane at LaGuardia, the sterile smell of recycled air clinging to his clothes as he adjusted his expensive watch. The watch, like everything else he wore, was a testament to the life he had built in New York, a life defined by success, wealth, and a hollow kind of satisfaction that lingered just beneath the surface. He had everything a man could want: a penthouse in Manhattan, a corner office with a view, and a social calendar packed with the kind of events that screamed success. Yet, as he walked through the airport, dragging his carry-on behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something vital was missing. The terminal buzzed with life, families reuniting, travelers hurrying to their gates, the clatter of footsteps and the murmur of voices creating a symphony of movement. Jack, however, felt strangely disconnected from it all, as if he were watching the world unfold through a pane of glass. He made his way to the baggage claim, eyes glazed over as he stared at the conveyor belt, slowly churning out bags. But then a flash of familiarity caught his eye. A woman, mid-30s, with a figure that held the memory of youthful grace, but was now tempered by time and experience. She stood not far from him, her eyes scanning the crowd as if searching for someone. For a moment, Jack's heart skipped a beat, and he was thrown back nearly 2 decades. Sarah? The name escaped his lips before he could stop himself, the sound barely a whisper. It couldn't be, he thought. Sarah, his ex-wife, the woman he had left 18 years ago without so much as a backward glance. But it was her. The realization hit him like a freight train, and he froze. His breath caught in his throat. Next to her stood a young woman. No, a girl, perhaps 17 or 18, with long chestnut hair and a familiar set to her jaw that made Jack's stomach twist in knots. The girl turned slightly, and he saw it then. The same eyes he looked at in the mirror every morning, the same slight arch in her brow. It was unmistakable. His daughter. The thought was both absurd and undeniable. Jack felt the ground shift beneath him, his carefully constructed life teetering on the edge of something he couldn't quite comprehend. How could this be? How could he not have known? His mind raced, fragments of the past, colliding with the present. He had left Sarah to chase his ambitions, telling himself it was for the best, that he deserved more than the quiet life they had built together in their small town. He had never stopped to consider the consequences, never paused to think about what he was leaving behind. He had traded a life with Sarah for the glittering allure of New York, and in doing so, he had lost not just a wife, but a daughter he never knew existed. They moved toward the exit, unaware of his presence, and Jack was left staring after them, the reality of his past mistakes slamming into him with brutal clarity. When they were finally out of sight, Jack forced himself to move, though his legs felt like lead. He walked slowly, almost mechanically, out of the airport and into the bright, unforgiving daylight of the city. But the bustling streets of New York felt alien to him now. The city that had once been his everything suddenly seemed cold and uninviting. Back at his apartment, Jack sat in the darkness, his phone clutched in his hand. He had always been a man of action, but tonight he was paralyzed by the weight of his discovery. He searched through old memories, trying to piece together the timeline, wondering how he had missed something so monumental. It took hours of sifting through the haze of the past before he finally made the connection. Sarah had been pregnant when he left. He had been so blinded by his ambition, so consumed by the pursuit of his own desires, that he hadn't noticed. He hadn't cared. Jack sat in his small, dimly lit apartment, staring at the card in his hand. The name on it read, Mason Walker, Private Investigator. The decision to hire Mason hadn't been easy, but after days of sleepless nights and torturous self-reflection, Jack knew he couldn't do this alone. The city of Madison was small, but its secrets had grown over the years, hidden away in lives he had once been a part of, but now felt entirely estranged from. Mason had a reputation for being thorough, discreet. Jack needed that. He needed someone who could piece together the life Sarah had built after he left, and someone who could guide him through the maze of his own regrets. The investigator had already sent his first report, a detailed account of Sarah's current life. She lived in Greenville, a small town a few hours away from Madison. The details had been clinical, almost cold, but the effect they had on Jack was anything but. As he read through the report, memories flooded back. Memories he had long suppressed. Jack recalled the early days of his relationship with Sarah, back when the world was full of promise, and they had been inseparable. They had met in college, both of them full of dreams and unburdened by the reality that life would eventually impose. Sarah had been his anchor, grounding him with her warmth and unwavering support. But Jack, ambitious and blinded by the allure of success, had been restless. He had wanted more money, more prestige, more of everything that seemed important at the time. He remembered the way her eyes had looked the day he told her he was leaving for New York. There had been tears, yes, but there had also been something else, something that haunted him now in the quiet of his lonely apartment. It was a look of betrayal, of someone who had been left behind, discarded. He hadn't seen it then, or perhaps he had chosen to ignore it, but now it was all he could think about. Jack wondered what life had been like for Sarah after he left. The report told him the basics. She had stayed in Madison for a few years, raising Emily on her own, before eventually moving to Greenville. She had worked multiple jobs, juggled bills, and struggled, yet somehow managed to keep going. Emily, according to Mason, was a bright student, with a knack for art, something Jack had never known. Every detail Mason uncovered was a dagger to Jack's heart, a reminder of the life he had missed out on, the family he had abandoned. He imagined Sarah, tired after a long day of work, coming home to a small, quiet house, the weight of the world on her shoulders, but never letting it show. He pictured Emily, growing up without a father, finding solace in her drawings, perhaps wondering what it would have been like if things had been different. The guilt was overwhelming, and Jack knew that he couldn't delay this any longer. The drive to Greenville was agonizingly slow, each mile stretching the tension inside him tighter. The road was flanked by trees, their leaves rustling in the wind, whispering secrets he was afraid to hear. The closer he got, the more his mind raced with questions. Would Sarah even speak to him? Would Emily recognize him? What could he say that would ever make up for the years of absence, the years of silence? By the time he reached Greenville, Jack felt like he had aged a decade. The town was quaint, with its small shops and quiet streets, a far cry from the hustle and bustle of New York. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where lives were intertwined, in ways that were both comforting and suffocating. He parked outside a modest house, the address Mason had given him. As he sat in the car, staring at the home where Sarah and Emily lived, the enormity of what he was about to do settled over him like a shroud. What right did he have to disrupt their lives now? After all this time, did they even want to see him? Jack's hand shook as he reached for the door handle, but he hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. For so long, he had thought of himself as a man who could face anything. But now, confronted with the reality of the past he had left behind, he felt small, insignificant. But this was his mess to clean up, his guilt to bear. He had to do this, for Sarah, for Emily, and maybe, just maybe, for himself. Taking a deep breath, Jack stepped out of the car and walked towards the house, each step heavier than the last. The past was a weight he would carry with him, but he was finally ready to face it. Jack stood on the porch of Sarah's house, his heart pounding against his ribs as if trying to escape the inevitability of the moment. He had rehearsed what he would say countless times on the drive over. But now, as he stared at the worn wood of the front door, all those words seemed to evaporate, leaving him with nothing but a gnawing sense of dread. He had no idea how she would react, but he knew it wouldn't be good. He raised his hand to knock, hesitating for a moment. The sound of his knuckles rapping against the door felt strangely final, like a bell tolling for something long dead. Jack waited, each second stretching into an eternity. When the door finally opened, the sight of Sarah hit him like a freight train. She stood there, her expression a mixture of shock, anger, and something else, something that looked dangerously close to pain. Her hair, streaked with grey, framed a face that was both familiar and distant. Time had etched lines of hardship into her features, lines Jack knew he had a hand in creating. "Jack," she said, the word heavy with disbelief. "Sarah," he managed to reply, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. For a moment, they just stood there, staring at each other as if trying to bridge the vast chasm of years that had opened between them. But whatever tenuous connection they might have had was quickly severed as the shock on Sarah's face gave way to fury. "What the hell are you doing here?" Her voice was sharp, cutting through the stillness of the afternoon like a blade. Jack swallowed, trying to find his voice, but nothing seemed sufficient to explain his presence. Sarah, I'm sorry. I know it's too late, but I needed to see you. To see Emily." "Emily?" Sarah's eyes narrowed, and Jack could see the fury in them intensify. "You think you can just show up after all these years and everything will be fine? You don't get to say her name. You don't get to waltz back into our lives and pretend you care after all this time. I know I made mistakes. Sarah, Mistakes? She interrupted, her voice rising. You call abandoning us a mistake? You left me when I needed you the most. I had to do everything on my own. Every sleepless night, every doctor's visit, every bill that I couldn't pay. I had to do it alone. Jack flinched at the bitterness in her words. He had known this would be hard, but nothing could have prepared him for the raw emotion in Sarah's voice. I was wrong, Sarah. I was selfish and blind, and I regret it every single day. Regret? She spat. Do you have any idea what it was like for me, for Emily? She grew up without a father. She had to watch other kids with their dads, knowing hers didn't care enough to stick around. The weight of her words crushed Jack, and he struggled to keep his composure. I want to make it right, Sarah. I want to be there for Emily, for both of you. Make it right. Sarah's laugh was bitter, filled with years of pent-up resentment. You think you can just walk back into our lives and everything will be fine. You can't fix this with apologies, Jack. You can't undo the years of pain you caused. Jack opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, another voice cut through the tension. Mum, what's going on? Emily appeared in the doorway, her eyes widening as she took in the scene. But there was something else in her gaze, something that made Jack's heart ache. Distrust, confusion, and a glimmer of anger. Emily, Jack said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. But before he could finish, Emily's expression hardened, and she turned to Sarah. Is this him? The man who left us? Sarah didn't need to respond. The answer was written all over her face. Emily's eyes flashed with a mix of hurt and fury. Jack felt a lump in his throat, the words he had planned to say suddenly feeling hollow and meaningless. Emily, I'm so sorry. I know I can't change the past, but I want to be a part of your life now. Emily shook her head. her voice trembling with emotion. You don't get to make that decision. You left. You don't get to decide when you come back. Jack felt the weight of her words like a punch to the gut. He had known this wouldn't be easy, but seeing the pain in Emily's eyes, pain that he had caused, was almost unbearable. He took a step forward, but Emily recoiled, her expression a mixture of anger and fear. "Just go," she said, her voice cracking. "We don't need you." Jack felt his heart shatter as the door closed in his face. He had hoped for a chance to explain, to start mending the broken pieces of their lives, but now he was left standing on the porch, alone, the weight of his choices pressing down on him like a vice. Jack Collins sat in his car, staring at the small house where Sarah and Emily lived. It was a modest place, the kind of home built on sacrifices and hard work. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. This wasn't just a visit. It was an attempt to bridge the gap he had created, to heal wounds that had festered for nearly 2 decades. But how? How could he ever make up for the time he had lost? The encounter on their porch a few days ago had been a disaster. He had seen the anger in Sarah's eyes, the bitterness that had etched deep lines into her once soft features. And Emily, his daughter, she had looked at him like he was a stranger, someone who had no right to be standing there, intruding on their lives. The realization had hit him hard. He had expected to be forgiven too easily, as if showing up could somehow erase the years of abandonment. Jack had always been a man of action, someone who believed that problems could be solved if you threw enough resources at them. And so, in his desperation, he had done what he knew best. He started sending gifts, expensive ones, a new laptop for Emily, flowers and jewelry for Sarah. He had even transferred money into Sarah's account, hoping it would lighten the financial burden she had carried alone for so long. But the more he gave, the colder their responses became. Sarah had returned the jewelry with a note that cut him deeper than any insult could have. "We don't need your money, Jack." The words haunted him. He had thought money could fix things, that he could somehow buy their forgiveness, but all he had managed to do was widen the gulf between them. One afternoon he decided to visit them again. This time he brought no gifts, only himself and the heavy burden of his mistakes. When Sarah opened the door, her face was a mask of exhaustion. It wasn't just physical tiredness, though that was there too, but an emotional weariness that made Jack feel even smaller. "Sarah," he began, his voice shaky. "I'm sorry. You thought you could just throw money at us and everything would be fine?" she interrupted, her tone sharp but not loud. The anger had settled into something more dangerous, disappointment. Jack felt a rush of shame. "I didn't know what else to do. I was trying to help, to make things easier." Sarah sighed, the sound full of years of pent-up frustration. "Money doesn't fix everything, Jack. It doesn't bring back the nights I spent worrying about how to feed Emily, or the times I had to comfort her when she was sick and asking for a father she didn't know." He looked down, unable to meet her eyes. "I know. I've been stupid. I thought that if I could make your lives a little better now, it would make up for what I missed." Sarah's gaze softened, but only slightly. "You can't make up for what you missed. You missed her first steps, her first words. You missed her school plays, her art shows. You missed everything." The weight of her words settled over Jack, and he realized just how much he had lost. Not just time, but experiences, memories that could never be reclaimed. He had been so focused on his own regrets that he hadn't stopped to think about what Sarah and Emily had gone through. What they still carried with them. "What can I do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I want to be here now. I want to be part of your lives." Sarah studied him for a long moment, and Jack could see the internal battle she was fighting. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady. "It's not about what you can give us, Jack. It's about what you're willing to do. Emily doesn't need a new laptop. She needs a father. I don't need jewelry. I need to know that you're here to stay this time, not just until things get hard again." Jack nodded, the truth of her words sinking in. "I am here to stay," he said, with a conviction that surprised even him. "I want to prove it to both of you. Not with money, but with time. With being here." Sarah gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Then start by showing up. Consistently. For her, not for yourself." As the door closed softly behind her, Jack stood on the porch, feeling both lighter and more burdened than before. He had a long way to go, a long way to prove that he was more than just a man who could buy things. He had to become the father and partner he should have been all along, and he knew that would take more than money. It would take time, patience, and the willingness to face the consequences of his absence head-on, and he was ready to start. Jack woke up early, the morning light filtering through the curtains of his modest apartment. The day stretched ahead of him, filled with the weight of expectations and the hope of mending what had been broken. He had been back in their lives for a few weeks now, but every interaction with Sarah and Emily still felt like treading on thin ice. Today, he was determined to take another step forward. After a quick breakfast, Jack made his way to Sarah's house. It was becoming a routine, showing up, offering help, and trying to fit himself into the rhythms of their lives. The house was small but warm, a reflection of the life Sarah had built through sheer will and perseverance. He knew that if he wanted any chance at rebuilding his relationship with them, he needed to start by understanding the world they lived in now. Sarah was in the kitchen when he arrived, her back turned as she prepared breakfast. She didn't look surprised to see him. They had an unspoken agreement now. He was welcome as long as he respected the boundaries she had set. There were no grand gestures, no forced conversations, just a quiet acknowledgement that he was there, trying. "Morning," Jack said, his voice low as he entered the room. "Morning," Sarah replied without turning around, her tone neutral. She wasn't cold, but the warmth that once existed between them was still a distant memory. "Do you need any help with that?" Jack offered, gesturing to the eggs she was scrambling. She glanced over her shoulder, considering for a moment before nodding. "Sure, you can slice the bread." It was a small task, almost insignificant, but Jack knew it was a start. He moved to the counter and began slicing the loaf of bread, trying to ignore the awkward silence that hung between them. This was how it had been for the past few weeks, slow, tentative interactions, as if they were both afraid of saying the wrong thing. As they worked side by side, Jack couldn't help but notice the lines of stress etched into Sarah's face. He had caused those lines, he realized. The years of struggling alone, of raising a child without support, had taken their toll on her. But there was also a strength there, a quiet resilience that he both admired and felt guilty about. She had become someone he didn't fully recognize, yet he wanted to understand. "I was thinking," Jack began, trying to keep his tone casual, "maybe we could go to the park this weekend. You know, all three of us. Get some fresh air." Sarah paused, her hands stilling as she considered his suggestion. "The park?" she repeated, as if the idea was foreign to her. "Yeah," Jack said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Just a simple outing. No pressure." She nodded slowly, though her expression remained guarded. "We'll see. It depends on how Emily feels." It was a tentative agreement, but Jack took it as a victory. He knew that with Sarah he had to be patient. that she needed time to let down the walls she had built around herself. Later that day, Jack found himself in the living room with Emily. She was curled up on the couch, her sketchpad resting on her knees as she drew. He watched her for a moment, unsure of how to approach her. Despite his efforts, there was still a distance between them, an invisible barrier that kept him from fully reaching her. "Those are really good," Jack said, nodding towards her drawings. Emily looked up briefly, her expression unreadable. "Thanks," she murmured, before returning her focus to the sketchpad. He could sense her hesitation, the way she pulled back whenever he tried to connect. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was more like she was protecting herself, afraid to let him in only to be hurt again. "I know I've missed a lot, Emily," Jack continued, keeping his voice soft. "But I'm here now, and I'd really like to get to know you better, if you'll let me." She didn't respond immediately, and for a moment, Jack feared he had pushed too hard. But then she shrugged, a small, almost imperceptible gesture that told him she wasn't completely shutting him out. It was a tiny crack in the wall she had built, but it was enough for now. As the days passed, Jack continued to show up. He helped Sarah with the household chores, took Emily to her doctor's appointments, and even started attending her art classes, sitting quietly in the back as she worked. He knew he still had a long way to go, that the road to forgiveness and trust was long and winding, but he was willing to walk it. Each day brought small victories, a shared laugh with Sarah over a memory from the past, a moment of connection with Emily when she showed him one of her finished pieces. These moments were fragile, like delicate threads weaving together the frayed edges of their relationships, but Jack held on to them, knowing that they were the foundation upon which he could rebuild their lives together. Jack sat at his makeshift desk in the corner of his apartment, staring blankly at his laptop screen. The emails and spreadsheets demanding his attention seemed trivial, almost absurd, in light of the call he had just received. His hands trembled as he reached for the phone again, half expecting the news to somehow change, but the words echoed in his mind with a chilling finality. "Emily's condition has worsened. She needs to be hospitalized immediately." He had known about the leukemia for only a few months, but the reality of it had never hit as hard as it did now. His daughter, his bright, beautiful Emily, was in danger of slipping away before he ever had the chance to truly know her. The thought made his chest tighten, a sensation he hadn't felt in years, not even during the most stressful moments of his career. This was different. This was fear on a primal level. He grabbed his coat and keys, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. The apartment door slammed shut behind him as he rushed to his car, the engine roaring to life as he sped toward the hospital. The drive was a blur, the world outside passing in a haze of color and sound, but all he could think about was Emily. The little girl he had abandoned in pursuit of a life that now felt hollow and meaningless. The girl who needed him now more than ever. When he arrived at the hospital, the sterile smell of antiseptic filled his nostrils, a sharp reminder of the seriousness of the situation. He found Sarah in the waiting room, her face pale, eyes red-rimmed from crying. She looked up as he approached, a mixture of relief and resignation in her gaze. "How is she?" Jack asked, his voice rough, barely more than a whisper. "They're stabilizing her," Sarah replied, her tone clipped, as if each word took immense effort. "But it's not good, Jack. The doctors say the leukemia is progressing faster than they expected." Jack felt the floor drop out from under him. He reached for a chair, sinking into it as the weight of the news settled on his shoulders. "What do they suggest? Is there anything more we can do?" "They're trying a new treatment," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "But it's a long shot. They don't know if it will work." The fear in her eyes mirrored his own, and for the first time, Jack realized just how alone she must have felt through all of this. How much she had been carrying on her own, even now, when she should have had someone to lean on. He took her hand in his, the gesture awkward but sincere. "We'll get through this, Sarah. I'm not going anywhere." Sarah looked at him, her eyes searching his, as if trying to gauge the truth in his words. After a moment, she nodded, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. "I hope you mean that, Jack. Because Emily needs you. She needs her father." Jack squeezed her hand gently before releasing it, then turned his attention to the room where Emily lay. When he walked in, the sight of her took his breath away. She looked so small in the hospital bed, her skin pale, dark circles under her eyes. An IV dripped steadily beside her, and the beeping of machines filled the silence. "Hey, sweetheart," he said softly, sitting down beside her and taking her hand in his. It felt fragile, like porcelain, and he had to remind himself to be gentle. "Dad," Emily whispered, her voice weak but steady. "I'm scared." The admission tore at his heart. "I know, honey. I'm scared too. But I'm here, and I'm not leaving. We're going to fight this together." She nodded, her grip on his hand tightening ever so slightly. For a moment, they sat in silence, the unspoken fear hanging between them, heavy and suffocating. But as the minutes passed, Jack began to talk, about anything and everything. He told her stories from his childhood, about the places he had visited, about things that didn't really matter but filled the silence, kept the darkness at bay. As he spoke, he saw something shift in Emily's eyes. The anger and distrust that had been there for so long seemed to soften, replaced by a tentative acceptance. She was letting him in, just a little, and Jack felt a glimmer of hope take root in his heart. Sarah watched from the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, but the hard lines of her face had softened too. She had been skeptical, and rightfully so, of his ability to be there for their daughter in any meaningful way. But now, seeing the way Jack sat beside Emily, how he listened to her, comforted her, she felt something begin to change within herself as well. Maybe, just maybe, he was capable of more than she had given him credit for. Jack stayed by Emily's side day and night, clumsy in his attempts to care for her, but unwavering in his dedication. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the quiet room where Emily slept. Jack sat in the chair beside her bed, his laptop open on his lap. He had been juggling conference calls and emails since dawn, trying to stay on top of the crisis unfolding back in New York. The company he had spent years building was teetering on the edge of chaos, and his absence was being felt keenly. But every time he glanced at Emily, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest as she slept, the decision became clearer. He couldn't leave her now, not when she needed him most. Emily's health had stabilized, but the road to recovery was long, and Jack knew that the bonds between them were still fragile. She was more receptive to his presence now, more willing to let him in, but there was still a distance between them, a lingering uncertainty that he couldn't ignore. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Sarah entered, carrying a cup of coffee. She handed it to him without a word, her eyes briefly meeting his before she turned her gaze to their daughter. "How is she?" Sarah asked, her voice low. "She's resting," Jack replied, taking the cup. "The doctors said she's improving, but slowly." Sarah nodded, her expression unreadable. There had been a shift between them, a gradual thawing of the tension that had defined their interactions since his return. It wasn't quite forgiveness, but it was something. A tentative understanding that they were in this together, for better or worse. "Have you heard anything from the office?" Sarah asked after a pause, her tone carefully neutral. Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Yes, things are getting worse. They need me there, but—" He trailed off, glancing at Emily. "I can't leave." Sarah studied him for a moment, as if weighing his words. "You've worked so hard for that company. Are you sure about this?" "Absolutely," Jack said, the conviction in his voice surprising even himself. "It took me too long to realize it, but this," he gestured to Emily, to the room around them, "this is what matters. I won't make the same mistake twice." For a moment Sarah's expression softened and Jack felt a glimmer of hope. She was seeing the change in him, the man he was trying to become. But then the guarded look returned, and she nodded curtly. "You should go. I'll stay with her." "No," Jack said firmly. "I'll work from here. They can manage without me in the office for a while longer." As the days passed, Jack continued to balance his responsibilities, shuttling between the hospital and the small apartment he had rented nearby. He kept in touch with his office through phone calls and video conferences, but he was careful not to let work encroach on his time with Emily. It was a delicate balancing act, one that required constant vigilance, but he was determined to make it work. Emily, though still weak, began to respond more to his presence. She talked to him more, shared small details about her life that he had missed. They were tentative steps, but they were steps nonetheless, and Jack cherished every one of them. One afternoon, while they sat together in the hospital's small garden, Emily turned to him with a question that caught him off guard. "Why did you come back?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. Jack hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because I realized how much I had missed," he finally said. "How much I had lost by staying away. I know I can't change the past, but I want to be here now, with you, with your mom. I want to make things right." Emily looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing his sincerity. Finally she nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but one that filled Jack with a quiet sense of victory. The crisis in New York continued to escalate, but Jack remained resolute. He delegated more, trusted his team to handle the day-to-day operations, and focused on what mattered most, his family. There were moments of doubt, times when he questioned if he was doing the right thing. But each time, the answer was the same. He couldn't abandon them again. In the quiet hours of the night when the hospital was still and the world outside seemed far away, Jack often found himself reflecting on the choices he had made. The sacrifices he had thought were necessary now seemed hollow in the face of the connections he was slowly rebuilding. There was still a long way to go, still so much work to be done to earn back the trust he had shattered, but for the first time in years he felt a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging. Jack stood at the edge of the small garden, watching the late afternoon sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in soft hues of pink and orange, casting a gentle light over the hospital grounds. Emily was sitting on a bench nearby, a blanket draped over her legs, the color slowly returning to her cheeks. She looked more like herself than she had in weeks, and the sight filled Jack with a quiet, profound relief. The past few months had been a test of endurance, of faith, both in himself and in the possibility of forgiveness. Emily's health had turned a corner. She was getting stronger, each day bringing a little more life back into her eyes. But the road to healing, for all of them, was far from over. He had learned, slowly and painfully, that he couldn't do this alone. The weight of his past mistakes was too heavy to bear without help, so he had reached out, not just to Sarah and Emily, but to the community around them. It was awkward at first. humbling for a man who had always prided himself on self-sufficiency, but necessary. Jack began attending church with Sarah, something he had never imagined himself doing. The sermons were simple, the congregation small, but there was a comfort in the routine, in the sense of belonging it fostered. He sought advice from the pastor, a kind man named Father Michael, whose words were always patient, never judgmental. It was through these quiet conversations that Jack started to understand what it meant to truly be a part of something greater than himself. Sarah noticed the changes, though she didn't say anything at first. She watched as Jack volunteered at the church, offering to help with the food pantry, fixing things around the building, doing whatever was needed without complaint. He was no longer the man who tried to buy forgiveness with expensive gifts. He was trying, really trying, to be the man she and Emily needed him to be. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Sarah finally broke the silence. "You're different now," she said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. Jack looked at her, the woman he had loved and lost, and now was slowly finding his way back too. "I had to change," he admitted. "I didn't like who I was before, and I knew you didn't either." Sarah nodded, her eyes searching his face. "You've done a lot, Jack. But you need to know, it's not about what you do for us. It's about being here, being present." "I understand that now," Jack replied. "I'm not going anywhere, Sarah. I'm here for the long haul." She studied him for a moment longer before giving a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough. It was a sign that she was beginning to let him in, beginning to trust him again. Emily's acceptance came more slowly, but it was there. She started to seek him out more often, asking him to join her for walks in the garden or to help with her art projects. There were still moments of tension, of awkward silences, but they were fewer and farther between. The wall she had built around herself was slowly crumbling, brick by brick, and Jack could see glimpses of the girl she used to be, the girl she could be again. One afternoon, as they walked through the park near their home, Emily surprised him with a question. "Do you think things will ever be normal again?" Jack took a moment to respond, choosing his words carefully. "I don't know if things will ever go back to what they were before. But maybe that's okay. Maybe we can find a new kind of normal, one that's better, stronger, because we're building it together." Emily seemed to consider this, her gaze thoughtful. "I'd like that," she said quietly. It was a simple exchange, but for Jack, it was monumental. It was proof that they were moving in the right direction, that the pieces of their broken family were slowly being put back together. As the days passed, the house began to feel more like a home. There was laughter again, shared meals and quiet moments that didn't feel so heavy with the past. Sarah and Jack started making plans, small ones at first, about the future. Where they would go, what they would do as a family once Emily was fully recovered. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was what mattered. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the backyard where a small gathering was underway. Laughter mingled with the soft strains of guitar music, creating an atmosphere of warmth and joy that had been absent for far too long. Jack stood near the grill, tending to the sizzling steaks, a contented smile playing on his lips. His business in New York had finally stabilized, allowing him the freedom to focus on what truly mattered. Sarah approached, 2 glasses of lemonade in hand. "Thought you might need this," she said, handing him one. "Thanks," Jack replied, taking a grateful sip. He glanced around the yard, taking in the scene. Friends from the community mingled, sharing stories and laughter. In the corner, Emily sat with a group of her peers, her eyes bright as she animatedly recounted a tale, her hands gesturing wildly. "She's come a long way," Sarah observed, following his gaze. Jack nodded, emotion tightening his throat. "We all have." A comfortable silence settled between them, filled with unspoken understanding. The journey had been arduous, marked by moments of doubt and pain, but standing here now, amidst the tangible proof of their resilience, it all seemed worth it. As dusk approached, Emily stood up, clinking her glass to draw attention. "I have something to say," she announced, her voice clear and confident. The chatter subsided as all eyes turned to her. "I just wanted to thank everyone for being here," she began, her gaze sweeping the crowd before settling on her parents. "And to Mom and Dad for never giving up on us." Jack felt a lump form in his throat. He exchanged a glance with Sarah, whose eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Emily continued, a soft smile gracing her lips. "We've been through a lot, but it's made us stronger. Here's to new beginnings." A chorus of cheers erupted, glasses raised in unison. Jack felt a hand slip into his, and he looked down to see Sarah's fingers entwined with his. He squeezed her hand gently, a silent affirmation of their shared journey. Later that evening, as the last of the guests departed, the family found themselves alone under a canopy of stars. Emily stretched out on the grass, pointing out constellations, while Jack and Sarah sat side by side on the porch steps. "Remember when we used to do this?" Sarah mused, her head resting on Jack's shoulder. "Every summer," Jack recalled, a hint of nostalgia in his voice. "Feels good to bring back old traditions." Emily's voice drifted over. "Dad, do you still remember the stories you used to tell about the stars?" Jack chuckled. "Some of them. Why? Looking for a bedtime story?" Emily laughed, the sound pure and uninhibited. "Maybe. It's been a while." Jack stood up, feigning deep contemplation. "Well, in that case, gather round. Let me tell you about Orion, the mighty hunter." As he began weaving tales of ancient heroes and celestial wonders, Sarah and Emily listened, their faces illuminated by both starlight and the rekindled warmth of family bonds. In that moment, the past's shadows seemed distant, replaced by the promise of a brighter, united future. Thank you so much for joining me on this emotional journey. Stories like these remind us of the power of love, forgiveness, and the lengths we'll go to for the people we care about. If you found yourself moved by Jack's struggles to reconnect with their families, don't forget to hit that like button and share this video with someone who might need a reminder of the importance of second chances. And, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss a new story. Remember, every day is a chance to rewrite your own story, so let's make it a good one. See you next time.